What would you do if the one you loved walked away? Charlotte Pierce, powerful, wealthy, untouchable. Nathan Reed, stubborn, hardworking, and convinced he'd never be enough for her. One rainy night, a simple act of kindness brought them together. But fear, pride, and the weight of two different worlds tore them apart. He ran. She let him. But love doesn't let go that easily. Would he fight for her before it was too late? Watch until the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. The first raindrop splattered onto the sidewalk just as Charlotte Pierce let out an exasperated sigh. Could this day possibly get any worse? She tightened her grip on the handles of her designer bag, already knowing the answer. Standing at a nearly deserted bus stop in the middle of downtown, she rummaged through her purse for what felt like the 100th time, her movements growing more frantic with each passing second. Lipstick, a set of keys, business cards, no wallet. Her phone screen remained dark and lifeless, the battery having given out hours ago. She squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling sharply in an attempt to steady her nerves. Charlotte prided herself on being in control of her company, her schedule, her life. But today, the universe seemed determined to test her patience. The day had started perfectly fine. A high-stakes meeting with investors, a few strategic handshakes, and an itinerary meticulously planned down to the last second. But somewhere between leaving the office and stepping out of a taxi, her wallet had vanished. No credit cards, no cash, and no means of calling anyone for help. And, of course, it had to start raining. Charlotte glanced up at the sky, as if silently challenging the heavens. The gray clouds loomed overhead, thick and heavy, and within seconds, the drizzle turned into a steady downpour. She muttered a curse under her breath, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Though it was little use, the rain seeped into the expensive fabric almost immediately. A few feet away, Nathan Reed shifted his weight from one foot to the other, watching her with mild curiosity. He had seen plenty of lost-looking people at this bus stop before, but never someone like her. She didn't belong here. Not with that sleek, tailored coat. Not with those poised, confident features that looked so out of place against the grimy backdrop of downtown's worn-out streets. He wasn't sure what was more surprising, the fact that she was standing here at all, or the fact that she looked absolutely miserable about it. Nathan had lived in this city long enough to recognize wealth when he saw it, and this woman screamed it. She radiated authority, the kind that came from years of being at the top. But right now, she looked less like a powerhouse and more like someone on the verge of losing her patience with the entire world. He noticed the way her fingers tightened around her bag, the sharp exhale of breath, as if preparing herself for some sort of battle. She wasn't the type to ask for help. That much was obvious. Still, something about the way she stood there, so stubborn yet so stranded, made Nathan hesitate. He had no business getting involved, but before he could talk himself out of it, the words were already out of his mouth. Need a hand? Charlotte turned sharply, startled by the deep, easy voice beside her. She hadn't noticed the man standing there, tall, lean, his dark brown hair tousled from the rain. Dressed in worn jeans and a plain black hoodie, he looked as if he belonged here, blending in effortlessly with the city's backdrop. His blue eyes, however, were calm and observant, holding none of the impatience she expected. For a second, Charlotte hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help from strangers. But she wasn't exactly in a position to be picky. She cleared her throat, trying to ignore the small pang of embarrassment. I lost my wallet. Nathan nodded, as if he had already figured that out. Got any friends nearby who can spot you?
She swallowed her pride and admitted, "My phone's dead."
Nathan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Rough day. Charlotte huffed. You have no idea. For a brief moment, Nathan debated his options. He had exactly $44.75 in his pocket, just enough to get him home after a long shift. But this woman, this stranger, needed it more than he did right now. Without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a couple of crumpled bills and some change, and held them out to her. Here, he said simply, bus fare. Charlotte blinked. She looked at the money, then back at him, searching for any sign of an ulterior motive. But there was none. Just quiet sincerity. For some reason, that made her chest tighten. She hesitated before finally taking the money. Thank you. Nathan shrugged. It's just a couple of bucks. But to Charlotte, it was more than that. Let me pay you back, she offered, already making a mental note to track him down later. Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. Don't worry about it. Just pass it on to someone else someday. That made her pause. He wasn't expecting anything in return. Before she could say... The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing against the wet pavement. Charlotte hesitated for half a second, then stepped aboard. As the doors slid shut, she turned back, catching a glimpse of Nathan through the rain-streaked window. He was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching the bus pull away. He had no idea that he had just given money to a woman who could have bought the entire bus company if she wanted to. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt something unexpected. She felt small, and for some strange reason, she didn't mind. The next morning, Charlotte Pierce sat in her penthouse office, staring at the glowing screen in front of her. But for once, the numbers and reports meant nothing. Her mind kept drifting back to the man from the bus stop, Nathan. The stranger who had handed her money without a second thought, without knowing who she was, without expecting anything in return. That kind of selflessness was something she rarely encountered in her world. Charlotte had built her empire on precision, control, and calculated moves. People in her industry didn't give without expecting something back. Investors always had an angle. Partners always weighed the risks. Even friendships, the few she had, were often tangled with business. But Nathan, he had just... no strings attached. She sighed, shaking her head as if trying to physically rid herself of the distraction. It was ridiculous. She didn't even know him. He was just a guy she'd met at a bus stop, a fleeting moment in her otherwise carefully structured life. And yet, something about him had stayed with her. A sharp buzz from her intercom interrupted her thoughts. Miss Pierce, her assistant's voice came through crisply. The department heads are waiting for you in the conference room. Charlotte exhaled, smoothing down her blazer. She pushed aside the lingering thoughts of last night and stood, stepping into her usual role. The poised, commanding CO who let nothing shake her. As she entered the conference room, conversations hushed. Executives straightened their posture, their attention immediately snapping to her. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air as she took her place at the head of the long, sleek table. Let's begin, she said, her voice even, professional. But then she saw him. At the far end of the room, near the maintenance panel, a man in navy blue work coveralls was adjusting a toolbox on the floor. His posture was relaxed, focused on his task, oblivious to the stares around him. Nathan.
Charlotte felt her breath hitch for just a second.
It was impossible. Yet there he was, standing right there in her building, in her company. What were the odds? Her heart pounded unexpectedly as he stood, stretching slightly before glancing up. Their eyes met. Nothing. No flicker of recognition. No shock. No realization that the woman he had helped last night was now sitting at the head of the table. Nathan simply gave a polite nod and turned back to his work as if she were just another executive in a building full of them. Charlotte, on the other hand, felt like the air had been knocked out of her. For the rest of the meeting, she went through the motions, listening to reports, approving proposals. But she was only half present. Her thoughts kept circling back to the moment their eyes met, the way he had looked at her with nothing more than detached politeness. After the meeting ended, she lingered, watching as Nathan packed up his tools and prepared to leave. Something inside her didn't want to let this be the last time she saw him. "Excuse me," she called out, keeping her voice steady. Nathan paused, glancing up. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte almost laughed. If only he knew. She straightened, crossing the room toward him. Nathan hesitated before replying. "Nathan Reed." Charlotte nodded as if hearing it for the first time. "How long have you worked here?" "About a year," he said, adjusting his grip on his toolbox. "Maintenance team." She studied him, noting the subtle wariness in his expression. He wasn't used to high-level executives paying attention to people like him. "Good," she said simply. "I'll see you around, Nathan." Then she turned and walked out before she could overthink it. But as she strode down the hallway, she couldn't shake the tiny smile tugging at the corner of her lips. A week passed, and Charlotte found herself unconsciously looking for him. She took the longer route to her office, subtly scanning the maintenance crews whenever she passed by. She spotted him occasionally, fixing an overhead light, checking an HVAC unit. But he never once looked at her the way she looked at her, the way she looked at him. Because to him, she was just another executive. It was an unfamiliar feeling, being unnoticed. People always recognized her, always sought her attention. But Nathan had no idea who she was. And strangely, Charlotte wasn't sure if she wanted to change that. Then one evening, while reviewing emails, something caught her attention. A complaint. Employee, Nathan Reed. Issue, alleged insubordination. Charlotte frowned, clicking into the report. According to the document, Nathan had challenged his supervisor, Mark Grayson, about unsafe working conditions. Her fingers curled slightly. Of course. She could already picture it. Nathan standing his ground, refusing to back down because he actually cared. She scrolled down to the recommended action. Suspension. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Not happening. Within minutes, she drafted an email to From CO Charlotte Pierce. Subject: Nathan Reed's review. I'd like to personally review the complaint regarding Nathan Reed before any action is taken. Until then, no disciplinary measures should be enforced. Charlotte Pierce. She hit send. Nathan would never know. But that didn't matter. Because Charlotte wasn't going to let a man like him be punished for doing the right thing. Charlotte didn't understand why she was doing this. She had a million more important things to focus on. Corporate negotiations, expansion plans, strategic acquisitions. Yet she found herself paying attention to something. Or rather someone, entirely unrelated to her world. Nathan Reed. It started subtly. She would take the longer route to her office just to pass by maintenance areas, pretending she wasn't looking for him. She occasionally found reasons to be in places she normally had no business being. An accidental detour through the break room. A spontaneous walk past the HVAC control room. She justified it to herself. It wasn't about him. It was curiosity, nothing more. But the more she observed, more intrigued she became. Nathan wasn't like the men in her world. He wasn't calculating, wasn't posturing, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just himself. He worked hard, never cutting corners. When he thought no one was looking, he would take a moment to wipe sweat from his brow, stretch out his sore shoulders, then push forward without complaint. She noticed the way others treated him, too. Unlike most people in maintenance, who were often overlooked, Nathan commanded respect. The younger workers seemed to look up to him, following his lead. Even the more senior staff, the ones who had been there for decades, listened when he spoke. And yet, for all his quiet strength, he never sought recognition. That was what made Charlotte want to talk to him again. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, she stood by the thermostat in her office, frowning. The temperature had been off all day, fluctuating from too cold to too warm, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't get it to stay consistent. She tapped the screen again, irritation bubbling. "Stupid thing," she muttered under her breath. "Maybe it's not the thermostat. Maybe it's operator error." The teasing voice came from behind her, and Charlotte turned to see Nathan standing in the doorway, arms crossed, an amused smirk tugging at his lips. She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" He stepped inside, barely glancing at the thermostat before expertly resetting it with a few simple taps. "There. Now your high-powered corporate life can continue at the perfect temperature." Charlotte crossed her arms.
I think I know how to work a thermostat.
Nathan chuckled. "Do you, though?" For a second, she almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "You seem pretty confident for a guy whose job description doesn't include challenging executives." Nathan shrugged. "I don't usually, but you make it easy." Charlotte wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. She settled somewhere in between. Should I be flattered or offended? Depends. Do you prefer people who tell you what you want to hear or people who tell you the truth? She considered that. In her world, people told her what they thought she wanted to hear all the time. Investors, board members, employees, even so-called friends. They measured their words carefully, always conscious of her position. But Nathan, he didn't care. He had no reason to. And for some strange reason, that made her like him even more. "Fine," she conceded, motioning toward the thermostat. "I'll admit you might be slightly better at fixing things than I am." Nathan smirked. "I'll put that on my resume." Charlotte rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress the small smile playing on her lips. After that, the encounters became more frequent. Sometimes it was just a nod in passing, other times a brief conversation in the hallway. Each interaction chipped away at the invisible wall between them. Charlotte found herself wanting to know more about him. Charlotte found herself wanting to know more about him. She started asking questions. At first, simple ones. How long had he worked here? Did he always enjoy fixing things? But then, the questions became more personal. She learned that Nathan worked 2 jobs just to keep up with rent and bills, that he had once dreamed of being an engineer but had never had the money for school, that he took care of his younger sister, Lena, after their parents passed away. He never complained. He simply accepted it. Charlotte found that both admirable and incredibly frustrating. She wanted to tell him he deserved more. Wanted to tell him that life didn't have to be this hard. But she knew Nathan wasn't the type to take handouts. So instead, she just listened. And somewhere along the way, she stopped thinking of him as just another employee. One evening, as Charlotte was heading toward the parking garage, she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. "She's great, man," Nathan's voice said, followed by a sigh. "But I can't." Charlotte frowned, stepping closer, unseen behind a row of storage shelves. His friend's voice came next. What do you mean you can't? Nathan exhaled sharply. I won't be that guy. The guy who dates a woman like Charlotte Pierce and just spends his life being a footnote in her story. Charlotte's stomach twisted. His friend hesitated.
So what are you gonna do?
Nathan's answer was quiet but clear. I'm going to let her go. Charlotte felt something inside her crack. She could handle rejection. She could handle distance, stubbornness, even anger. But this... Nathan wasn't rejecting her because he didn't care. He was rejecting her because he didn't believe in what they could be. And that was something Charlotte Pierce didn't know how to fight. Charlotte had never been one to second. Guess herself. Every decision she made, from multi-million-dollar deals to the way she took her coffee, was deliberate and calculated. Yet, as she sat in her office the next morning, staring blankly at her computer screen, all she could think about was Nathan's words. I won't be that guy. The guy who dates a woman like Charlotte Pierce and just spends his life being a footnote in her story. It gnawed at her, not just because he had rejected her, but because of why. He didn't push her way out of disinterest. He did it because he thought he wasn't enough. And worse, because he believed she saw him that way too. That was the part that stung. Nathan didn't know her. Not really. He had only seen fragments. The polished CEO, the businesswoman in sharp suits and high heels. He didn't know the nights she spent working late, the friendships she had sacrificed, the loneliness that came with success. He had no idea that, for the first time in years, she had met someone who didn't treat her like a power move or a status symbol. And now he was walking away. She wasn't sure what annoyed her more. The fact that he had made the decision without even giving her a chance to argue, or the fact that she actually cared enough to want to argue in the first place. Her intercom buzzed, snapping her back to reality. Pierce, her assistant's voice chimed in. Jacob Sterling is here for your scheduled meeting. Charlotte inhaled sharply, pushing aside the whirlwind of emotions Nathan had stirred in her. Send him in, she said, her tone composed, collected, the way it always was. Jacob entered with his usual air of confidence, his designer suit crisp, his smile easy. He was everything that made sense on paper, wealthy, ambitious, well-connected. The kind of man people expected her to be with. Charlotte, he greeted, sliding into the chair across from her. I have to say, I was looking forward to this meeting. We've got a lot to discuss. She nodded, but her mind wasn't on business. For the first time, as she looked at Jacob, his smooth charm, his perfectly curated persona, she felt absolutely nothing. And she knew why. Because her mind was elsewhere. Because her heart, despite every logical reason it shouldn't be, was somewhere in a dimly lit maintenance room, listening to a stubborn man say he was going to let her go. Jacob was speaking, but Charlotte barely registered the words. It didn't matter, because she had already made a decision. When the meeting ended, she didn't linger. She walked straight to the elevator, pressing the button for the lower floors. She wasn't going to let Nathan decide for her. By the time she reached the maintenance wing, she wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say. All she knew was that she wasn't leaving until he heard her out. She turned a corner and found him, bent over a large vac unit, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease on his forearm. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, steeling herself, she stepped forward. Need a hand? Nathan stiffened. Slowly, he turned his head, his blue eyes narrowing when he saw her. What are you doing here? His voice was quieter than usual, guarded. Charlotte folded her arms, her stance firm. I wanted to talk. Nathan let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. Charlotte, you don't get to make this decision for me, she cut in. His jaw tightened. I'm not. Really? Because from where I'm standing, you already decided that we don't work. That I see you as less. She stepped closer, her voice steady but laced with frustration. But you're wrong, Nathan. You're so unbelievably wrong. He looked away as if trying to gather his thoughts. You don't get it. Then make me get it. Nathan exhaled sharply, finally meeting her gaze. You don't know what it's like, Charlotte. To wake up every day knowing no matter how hard you work, you'll always be 5 steps behind people like you. I've had to fight for everything. Every job, every paycheck, every damn thing I have. And you, he shook his head, you don't have to fight for anything. Charlotte's heart clenched. You think I haven't fought? She asked, her voice softer now. You think I woke up one day with all of this? That it wasn't years of sacrifice, of losing people, of being told I wasn't enough? Nathan hesitated. You're not the only one who knows what it's like to feel like an outsider in their own world, she continued. And you're definitely not the only one who's afraid. He swallowed, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You think walking away makes you noble, she said. But all it does is prove that you never believed in me. In us. Silence. For the first time since she'd met him, Nathan had no response. Charlotte studied him, waiting, hoping. But then, his expression hardened. We belong to 2 different worlds, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And, just like that, she knew. She could fight for him. She could push. But it wouldn't matter. Not until he was ready to fight for them too. Charlotte nodded slowly, even though it felt like something inside her was breaking. Then I won't fight you on this, she said. And without another word, she turned and walked away, even though it killed her to do it. Charlotte had never been one to dwell on things she couldn't control. She had built her entire life around discipline, around moving forward no matter what. But for the first time in years, she found herself stuck, unable to shake the lingering weight of a conversation that had ended with Nathan Reed telling her they came from 2 different worlds. She had walked away that day, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. She could fight boardrooms, investors, and cutthroat competitors, but she couldn't fight someone who had already decided he wasn't enough. So, she did what she always did, threw herself into work. She attended meetings, signed off on contracts, and presented quarterly reports, all with the same unshakable precision. On the surface, nothing had changed, but deep down, she knew better. Because no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she kept looking for him. Not intentionally, not at first. But every time she stepped out of her office, she found her gaze drifting toward the lower floors. Every time she passed a maintenance team in the hallways, her heart leapt before she realized it wasn't him. And then, just as she was convincing herself to move on, his name appeared on her screen. Employee Complaint Review, Nathan Reed. Charlotte's stomach twisted as she clicked the report. Reason for disciplinary action: alleged insubordination toward supervisor Mark Grayson. She already didn't like where this was going. Scrolling further, she skimmed the details. Nathan had challenged Grayson over unsafe working conditions. The official recommendations. The official recommendation: immediate suspension pending review. Her grip on the mouse tightened. She could picture it. Nathan standing his ground, refusing to back down because he actually cared. He wasn't the kind of man who ignored problems, especially when they affected others. And now, he is being punished for it. Her jaw clenched as she drafted an email in record time from CO Charlotte Pierce to Department. Subject: Nathan Reed's review. I'd like to personally review the complaint against Nathan Reed before any disciplinary action is taken. Until then, no suspension will be enforced. Charlotte Pierce. She hit send without hesitation. Nathan would never know she'd stepped in for him. And maybe that was for the best. Because it wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about making sure the right thing was done. That night, as she sat alone in her penthouse, overlooking the glowing skyline, she let herself think about him, really think about him. He had pushed her away because he thought he wasn't good enough, because he believed their worlds would never align. But he was wrong. Because if Nathan Reed had taught her anything, it was that life wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about who you were when no one was looking. And the truth was, she wasn't sure she had ever admired anyone more. Meanwhile, Nathan had no idea any of this was happening. He had spent the past few days convincing himself that walking away had been the right thing to do, that he had saved himself from inevitable heartbreak, from becoming just another disposable chapter in Charlotte's world. But no matter how many times he told himself that, it never felt true. Because he missed her. More than he wanted to admit. And when he showed up to work the next morning, expecting to be handed a suspension notice, only to find that the complaint had been suddenly put on hold, he had a feeling something, or someone, had intervened. His gut told him exactly who. But instead of seeking her out, instead of thanking her, he turned away. Because even now, knowing that she had stepped in for him, he still wasn't ready to believe he could stand beside her. And so, for the first time in his life, Nathan Reed did something he had never done before. He ran. He ran. Not physically, not in the obvious sense. But every time he saw her in the hallways, he took a different route. Every time she passed by, he pretended not to notice. He buried himself in work, took on extra shifts. Anything to keep himself busy, to avoid her, to pretend like she had never mattered. But deep down, he knew better. Because when someone like Charlotte Pierce walks into your life, you don't just forget. You just hope, one day, you won't be too much of a coward to face what you're running from. Charlotte wasn't a woman who begged. She had never chased after anything, or anyone, who didn't want to be caught. But as the weeks passed, she found herself noticing every time Nathan walked in the opposite direction, every time his answers became clipped, every time his answers became clipped, every time he refused to meet her eyes. It wasn't just avoidance. It was deliberate. And it stung more than she cared to admit. Fine. If he wanted to pretend she didn't exist, she could play that game too. She stopped looking for him, stopped taking the longer route to her office, stopped finding reasons to be in places she had no business being. Instead, she threw herself back into work, into the controlled world of board meetings and investor pitches, into the life that had once felt so fulfilling. But it wasn't the same. And she hated that it wasn't. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Charlotte stepped outside onto the rooftop terrace of her building, needing air. The city stretched before her, glittering and endless, a constant reminder of everything she had built. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt empty. Because what was the point of having everything if, at the end of the day, she had no one to share it with? She closed her eyes, inhaling the crisp night air. She refused to let herself think about him. She had given him space. She had given him time. But if Nathan Reed still couldn't see what was right in front of him, maybe it was time to stop waiting. Meanwhile, Nathan was having his own battle. He told himself he had done the right thing, that it was better this way. But every time he saw her, Every time he caught a glimpse of her laughing in a meeting or passing him in the hallway without so much as a glance, it felt like a punch to the gut. Had he really expected her to wait for him, to chase after him? She was Charlotte Pierce. She had an empire to run. And he was just the guy who'd been stupid enough to push her away. Late one night, after finishing a maintenance call on one of the upper floors, Nathan headed toward the parking garage. He had barely taken 2 steps before he heard voices around the corner. One of them made him stop in his tracks. Jacob Sterling. Nathan had never liked him. The guy always walked around like he owned the world, like he expected people to fall in line just because he snapped his fingers. And right now, he was talking about Charlotte. "Come on, Charlotte." Jacob's voice was smooth, confident. "You and I both know this makes sense. You need someone who understands your world, who can stand beside you." Nathan's hands clenched into fists. Charlotte's voice came next, cool, unreadable. "And you think that someone is you?" Jacob chuckled. "Why not? You're wasting time with people who will never fit into your life. You need someone at your level. Someone who—" "I think you should leave," Charlotte cut in. Nathan could almost hear the tension in the silence that followed. "Charlotte." "I said, leave." Footsteps, then silence. Nathan barely had time to step back before Jacob brushed past him, scowling. He hesitated for only a second before rounding the corner, finding Charlotte standing there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't look away. "You're still here," she said softly. Nathan swallowed, suddenly feeling like the biggest idiot in the world. "Yeah." Something flickered in her gaze. Why? Why? It was a simple question, one she deserved an answer to. But Nathan didn't have one. At least not one that made sense. So instead, he said the only thing that felt real. "I don't know." Charlotte nodded slowly, studying him like she was trying to figure out what to do with him. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. And this time, he was the one left standing there, wondering what the hell he had just done. Charlotte wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe some kind of breakthrough, some acknowledgement from Nathan that he had made a mistake, that he had been wrong to walk away from her. But all she got was, "I don't know." And somehow, that was worse than if he had just said, "I don't care." Because it meant he did. It meant he felt something, but was still too afraid to do anything about it. And Charlotte Pierce did not wait around for men who couldn't make up their minds. She spent the next few days throwing herself into work, more determined than ever to push him out of her thoughts. And for a while, it worked. Until she found herself in the middle of another executive meeting, presenting a major proposal, only to glance toward the back of the room and see Nathan. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. He was fixing something along the back wall, his focus completely on his work, as if he wasn't surrounded by some of the most powerful people in the company. And yet, Charlotte could feel him. The tension was unbearable. She forced herself to focus, to keep her voice even as she ran through the numbers, the projections, the carefully laid out strategy. But when she caught sight of him again, just a glimpse, a quick glance from the corner of her eye, she lost her train of thought. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else in the room, but she noticed. She never lost her train of thought. Not in meetings, not in negotiations, not in high-stakes deals where the wrong word could mean millions. And yet, here she was, completely thrown off because of a man who wasn't even looking at her. She hated it. When the meeting ended, she lingered, pretending to check something on her phone as the room emptied out. Nathan was still there, packing up his tools, moving like nothing had happened. Like she wasn't standing right there. "Do "Do you always sneak into executive meetings?" she asked. Nathan glanced up, brow raised. "I wasn't sneaking. I was working." Charlotte crossed her arms, stepping closer. He shrugged. "Guess so." Liar. She studied him, searching for something, anything, that would tell her what he was thinking. But Nathan Reed had perfected the art of saying nothing at all. And Charlotte was done waiting for him to figure himself out. "You know what?" she said, tilting her head. "Forget it. I don't have time to play games with someone who can't decide what they want." Nathan stiffened slightly, but she didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel, heels clicking against the floor, refusing to look back. If he wanted to be a coward, that was his problem. She had wasted enough time on a man who didn't know if he was willing to fight for her. But what Charlotte didn't see, what she missed, was the way Nathan watched her walk away. The way his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. The way he looked at her like he wanted to say something. But still, he said nothing. Nathan told himself that walking away from Charlotte was the right thing to do. He had repeated it so many times in his head that it almost felt like the truth. Almost felt like the truth. But no matter how many times he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. That feeling only got worse when he overheard the conversation in the executive lounge one evening while fixing a vending machine. Jacob Sterling's voice carried across the room, smooth and confident as ever. "She's finally seeing reason." He was finally seeing reason. It was only a matter of time before Charlotte realized she needed someone like me. One who actually belongs in her world. Nathan's grip on the vending machine tightened. Another executive chuckled. "I don't know, Jacob. She's never seemed particularly interested." Jacob scoffed. "She's Charlotte Pierce. She plays hard to get. But eventually, she'll make the smart choice. She always does." Nathan didn't realize he had clenched his jaw until he felt the ache. A smart choice. Like Jacob Sterling was the only logical option. Like the idea of Charlotte choosing anything else. Choosing him was out of the question. It shouldn't have bothered him. But it did. Because deep down, he knew Jacob was waiting for the moment Charlotte would give up on him completely. And the worst part, Nathan had practically handed it to him. For the rest of the night, Nathan couldn't shake the unease settling in his gut. Had he really expected Charlotte to wait around forever? And if she finally did let go of him, was he really okay with that? Charlotte didn't know why she was still thinking about him. She had told herself she was done, that she wasn't going to waste another second on a man who couldn't decide if he wanted her. And yet, as she sat in her office later that evening, flipping through reports, her mind kept drifting. To the way Nathan had looked at her in that meeting. To the way he had watched her, even when he pretended he wasn't. She was so tired of this. She had always been the one in control, always been the one making decisions. So why did it feel like she was waiting for him? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A new email. Subject: Charity Gala Invitation. Charlotte barely skimmed the details before she noticed something that made her pause. One of the teams being honored that night, the maintenance crew. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Nathan was going to be there. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But then, she thought about Jacob Sterling. About the way he spoke like Charlotte was some prize to be won, like her choices had already been made for her, and suddenly, the decision wasn't difficult at all. She would go. Not for Nathan. Not even to prove a point. But because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to see what would happen if she stopped waiting. The gala was exactly what Charlotte expected. Elegant, refined, and filled with the kind of people who thrived in her world. Investors, executives, and socialites all dressed in their finest, moving effortlessly through the grand ballroom like they belonged there. She belonged there, too. But tonight, she wasn't looking for champagne toasts or empty business conversations. Tonight, she was looking for him. Her dress, sleek, black, understated but commanding, felt like armor as she scanned the room. The charity event honored several teams within the company, including the maintenance crew, which meant Nathan had to be here somewhere. She spotted Jacob first, holding court among a group of executives, laughing a little too loudly at something unfunny. He saw her almost instantly, his expression shifting into something smug. Charlotte ignored him. She had other things on her mind. And then, finally, she saw Nathan. He stood near the far side of the room, away from the spotlight, dressed in a simple but well-fitted suit. His posture was relaxed, hands in his pockets, as if this entire event was just another job to get through. But his eyes, those sharp, knowing blue eyes, were watching her. For the first time in weeks, she let herself look at him. Really look. And she could tell the moment he realized he had lost the battle he'd been fighting with himself. Because for all his avoidance, all his excuses, all his reasons for keeping his distance, he was still watching her like she was the only thing that mattered in the room. Nathan exhaled slowly, shaking his head like he couldn't believe she was there. And Charlotte? She smiled. It wasn't planned, wasn't strategic. It just happened. Like she was tired of pretending this didn't matter. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, and for a second, she thought he might walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he started toward her. The crowd blurred around them, voices fading into white noise as he closed the space between them. When he stopped standing just close enough for her to catch the faintest trace of soap and worn leather, he hesitated. Then, in a voice lower than she had ever heard it, he said, "You look incredible." Charlotte arched a brow, smirking. "You sound surprised." Nathan huffed out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Not surprised. Just trying to figure out how I ended up in the same room as you again. Maybe it's fate." He looked at her, really looked at her, and she swore something in his gaze softened. "Maybe," he murmured. Before she could say anything else, movement from the corner of her eye pulled her attention. Jacob. He was watching them, his expression unreadable, but his body language tense. Then, with the confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of being turned down, he made his way over. Charlotte barely had time to brace herself before he was there, standing beside her, all charm and manufactured ease. "Charlotte," he said smoothly, "I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk." Nathan shifted slightly, his jaw tightening again. Charlotte's pulse ticked up, not because of Jacob, but because of the way Nathan went still. Not jealous, not possessive, but something deeper, like he suddenly realized just how easily she could walk away. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw it. Fear. Fear. Not of her, but of losing her. Jacob was still talking, still making some half-hearted attempt at flirting, but Charlotte barely heard him, because she was too busy watching Nathan. Watching the way he clenched his fists at his sides, watching the flicker of something raw cross his face before he shut it down. He was this close to walking away again. And she couldn't let that happen. So, without giving herself time to overthink, Charlotte reached out, casual, effortless, and placed her hand on Nathan's arm. His entire body went rigid. Jacob faltered mid-sentence. Charlotte smiled sweetly, looking up at Nathan. "I think we were in the middle of something, weren't we?" It wasn't a question. It was a lifeline. Nathan's gaze snapped to hers, searching, wary, hopeful. And then, finally, he did the one thing she had been waiting for him to do all along. He didn't run. He stayed. Nathan wasn't sure what shocked him more, Charlotte touching his arm in front of Jacob or the fact that he didn't pull away. For weeks, he had been convincing himself that walking away from her was the right thing to do, that staying in his lane, keeping his head down, was the only way to protect himself from the inevitable heartbreak of wanting something. Someone he thought he could never have. But in that moment, standing there with her fingers lightly resting on his sleeve, he didn't want to run anymore. Jacob's smirk had tightened, his confidence flickering for just a second before he recovered. "Well, I won't keep you," he said smoothly, though his tone was clipped. "But Charlotte, let's talk later. I have some things I think you'd be interested in." Charlotte barely spared him a glance. "I doubt it." Nathan didn't hide his smirk this time. Jacob's jaw ticked, but he didn't push further. Instead, he gave one last measured look between them before turning on his heel and disappearing into the crowd. Nathan exhaled. "You didn't have to do that." Charlotte arched a brow. "You mean save you from walking away again?" He swallowed. "I wasn't." She tilted her head, daring him to finish that sentence. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right." She crossed her arms. "Yes." That made him huff a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Of course you do." For a moment, they just stood there, the energy between them shifting into something quieter, more uncertain. The music, the clinking of glasses, the chatter of the gala, all of it faded into the background. Charlotte's voice softened. "Nathan." His chest tightened. Because he was afraid. Not of her, not of wanting her, but of what came next. He had spent his whole life scraping by, making ends meet, always feeling like he was one wrong step away from losing everything. Charlotte was different. Charlotte was different. She had power, wealth, control. Things he had never even dared to imagine for himself. And if he let himself have her, if he let himself believe in this, what happened when she realized he would never be enough? Nathan swallowed hard, looking away. "Because I need to be someone before I can stand next to you." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. "Nathan." "No." He shook his head, forcing himself to keep going. "You deserve someone who doesn't have to second, guess every damn thing before reaching for you. Someone who's already built something for himself, who doesn't have to wonder if people are watching and thinking, what is she doing with a guy like him?" She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You really think I care about any of that?" His throat tightened. "I don't," she continued. "I never did." Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "I know you don't." She fell silent, studying him. And he hated the way she looked at him. Not with pity, not with disappointment, but with understanding. Because she knew. She knew that until he believed he was enough, nothing she said would change anything. And that, more than anything, was what made her take a step back. Charlotte inhaled slowly, composing herself. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "All right." Nathan frowned. "All right." She nodded. "If that's what you need, then fine. Go prove it to yourself." His stomach twisted. She wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was letting him go. And somehow, that felt worse than anything else. Before he could say anything, Charlotte turned, her expression unreadable as she disappeared into the crowd. Nathan didn't chase her. Because this time, if he was ever going to have her, He needed to make damn sure he had himself first. Nathan had never been more certain, or more terrified, of a decision in his life. Charlotte had let him go without anger, without pleading, without trying to change his mind. And somehow, that made it worse. Because she wasn't giving up on him, she was waiting. Waiting to see if he would finally become the man he was too afraid to believe he could be. So, he didn't waste time. The very next day, Nathan took the first step. He enrolled in online business courses. It wasn't much, just a handful of classes on engineering management and entrepreneurship. But it was something. Something for himself. Balancing coursework with his full-time job wasn't easy. He worked long shifts, then spent late nights studying, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. Some nights exhaustion clawed at him, telling him to give up, to accept that men like him weren't meant to build anything. But every time he thought about quitting, he reminded himself why he was doing this. For himself. For her. For a future where he could finally stand beside Charlotte without feeling like an outsider in her world. Months passed. Slowly, steadily, he grew. He learned. He networked. He started making plans, not just vague dreams, but actual steps towards starting his own small maintenance and engineering firm. And unbeknownst to him, Charlotte was watching. She never interfered, never made things easier for him. But every now and then, she heard whispers about how Nathan had picked up extra shifts, how he was taking courses, how he was turning down better, paying jobs because he wasn't looking for a handout. She could have helped. With a single call, she could have given him every resource he needed. But she didn't. Because this wasn't about her. This was about him. And so, she waited. They still saw each other sometimes. Brief encounters in hallways, the occasional exchange of glances across a room. But neither of them pushed. There were no declarations of love, no grand speeches. Just two people standing on opposite sides of something unspoken. Until the day everything changed. Nathan sat at his desk, staring at the small envelope in his hands. Inside was a bus ticket. The same kind of ticket he had once given Charlotte on a rainy night when she had been stranded without a wallet. Only this time, the ticket wasn't for her to get home. It was for her to come back to him. His hands were steady as he pulled out a small card he had tucked inside the envelope. A simple note, scrawled in his own handwriting. "I've changed, but one thing never has. I still love you." And with that, he sent it. No second guessing, no fear. Because for the first time in his life, Nathan Reed was finally ready to fight for what he wanted. And what he wanted was Charlotte Pierce. Charlotte nearly dropped the envelope when she saw Nathan's name on it. Her fingers trembled as she carefully pulled out the contents. A bus ticket and a handwritten note. "I've changed, but one thing never has. I still love you." For a long moment, she just stared at the words. She had spent months convincing herself that if Nathan wanted her, he would have to be the one to fight. That she wouldn't be the one chasing him. But now, he had finally made his move. And before she could second guess herself, before she could overanalyze what this meant, she grabbed her coat and ran. The city was alive around her. Cars honking, people rushing past, but all Charlotte could focus on was getting to the bus stop. The place where it all began. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she turned the last corner, her breath short, her heart pounding. And then she saw him. Nathan stood there, hands in his pockets, looking exactly the same, but somehow completely different. She stopped a few feet away, her chest rising and falling as she took him in. The way he looked at her, steady, unshaken, sure, was enough to make her throat tighten. For the first time since they had met, there was no hesitation in his gaze. No fear. Just him. Just her. Just them. Charlotte swallowed hard. You took long enough. Nathan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Told you. I don't give up easy. A slow smile tugged at her lips. Good, because neither do I. And then, before she could stop herself, before she could even think, she closed the distance between them. Nathan caught her as she threw herself into his arms, his grip tightening around her like he had no intention of ever letting go. And this time, he wouldn't. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply, like he was trying to memorize everything about this moment. I'm sorry it took me so long. Charlotte pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands gripping the lapels of his jacket. You're here now. That's all that matters. Nathan exhaled, pressing his forehead to hers. I meant what I said. His voice was rough, real. I love you, Charlotte. A breathless laugh escaped her. I know. And then, finally, she kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was months of longing, of frustration, of two people who had fought so hard to find their way back to each other. The city kept moving around them. But for them, in that moment, nothing else existed. Some love stories aren't about perfection. They're about choosing each other, again and again, no matter the obstacles. Nathan and Charlotte came from different worlds. But in the end, their hearts spoke the same language. Because true love doesn't care about status, wealth, or obstacles. It just finds a way. Lesson from the story. Love isn't about status, wealth, or where you come from. It's about who you choose to fight for and whether you're willing to grow into the person that love deserves. Nathan and Charlotte's story teaches us that timing matters, but effort matters more. Nathan had to believe in himself before he could believe in a future with Charlotte. And Charlotte had to be patient enough to let him find his own way back. Sometimes, love isn't about chasing or waiting. It's about becoming. It's about knowing when to step back and when to step forward. Real relationships aren't just built on feelings. They're built on growth, trust, and choosing each other over and over again. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. Love is not about where you start. It's about where you're willing to go together. Let's connect. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional, thought-provoking stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you.